What if the person you trusted the most, the one who stood at the pulpit, guiding your faith, was hiding a monstrous secret? Sister Maria was the perfect image of purity, kind, devout, and deeply respected by her parish. But behind the serene smile of this 21-year-old nun lurked an unthinkable plan for revenge. She wasn't just spreading God's word. She was spreading something far darker, and no one suspected the truth. Her victims? Not strangers, but the very people who worshipped alongside her. Her reason? A betrayal so devastating it would break her faith and ignite a dangerous desire for retribution. Stick around as we uncover the shocking events that rocked this small-town church and the harrowing truth behind Sister Maria's final confession. Before we dig deeper, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more stories like this for you. You won't want to miss them. To the parishioners of St. Benedict's Church, Sister Maria was an angel in human form. At just 21, she had become a source of hope in their small, devout town. She joined the convent straight out of high school, trading a life of worldly ambitions for one of service, humility, and prayer. Her gentle demeanor, selflessness, and unwavering faith earned her the nickname, the Saint of St. Benedict's. She dedicated her days to helping the sick, teaching children in Sunday school, and comforting those who sought guidance. It wasn't uncommon to see her walking through the cobblestone streets, carrying baskets of food for the needy, or praying with someone who had just lost a loved one. Her presence radiated calmness, and for those who knew her, she was a true representation of God's love. But behind the angelic reputation, Maria carried a secret pain. She had chosen the convent not just for her love of God, but as an escape from her troubled past. Orphaned at a young age, Maria had grown up in foster care, shuttled between homes where love was scarce and hardship was plentiful. The convent had offered her a refuge, a chance to finally belong. At the heart of the church was Father Dominic, a charismatic leader beloved by the congregation. He was a man of charm and eloquence whose sermons drew people from neighboring towns. His words carried the weight of authority, and his reputation was untarnished. Maria, like many others, trusted him completely. She often sought his advice and leaned on him as a father figure she never had. But Maria's perception of Father Dominic would soon begin to crack. It started with subtle hints, whispers among the older nuns, fragments of conversations that fell silent whenever she entered a room. She noticed the way some young women avoided him, their eyes downcast, and how his praise for certain parishioners felt unsettling. At first, Maria brushed it off. She told herself she was imagining things, blinded by her respect for him. After all, how could a man of God, someone she trusted so deeply, have anything to hide? It was during one of the church's annual spiritual retreats, a secluded week-long event held in a remote countryside convent, that the unthinkable happened. The retreat was meant to deepen their connection with God, focusing on silence, prayer, and introspection. On the third night, Father Dominic invited Maria to his private quarters for a special discussion about her spiritual growth. She was nervous but honored. After all, it was rare for him to give personal attention to anyone outside of sermons. In his quarters, Dominic offered her tea, which she accepted without question. As they spoke, Maria began to feel lightheaded. Her vision blurred, and her body felt heavy, almost as though she were sinking into the chair. She tried to stand, confused and alarmed, but her legs buckled beneath her. "Relax, Sister Maria," Dominic said, his tone calm but chilling. "You've been under so much pressure lately. Let me help you." Maria couldn't fight back. Her mind screamed for her to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. The last thing she remembered was the flickering candlelight on Dominic's desk and the sound of his footsteps moving closer. When Maria woke up, it was hours later, back in her own quarters. Her head throbbed, and her body felt strange, violated. At first, she tried to convince herself that it had been a bad dream, a trick of her overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew the truth. Dominic said nothing to her the following day, acting as though nothing had happened. Maria, terrified and confused, stayed silent. Who would believe her? He was the trusted shepherd of their parish, a man of God. She was just a young, naive nun. It wasn't until months later, after she began experiencing alarming symptoms, unexplained fevers, constant fatigue, and weight loss, that the full extent of what Dominic had done to her came to light. A hospital visit confirmed her worst fears. Maria had contracted HIV. The doctor's questions were clinical but cutting. "Have you been sexually active, Sister Maria?" the physician asked, clearly baffled by the diagnosis. Maria couldn't bring herself to answer. How could she explain that her vow of chastity had been taken from her, not by choice, but by betrayal? The confirmation shattered her. The virus wasn't just a death sentence, it was a grim reminder of what Dominic had done. Every symptom, every ache in her body felt like a scar left by his actions. Her faith, once her greatest source of strength, began to crumble under the weight of her anger and despair. Few months later, Maria incidentally found a tattered diary at a secluded orchard around the chapel. It was written by another victim, someone who had also been preyed upon by Dominic. The entries not only confirmed her suspicions but revealed the pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. Maria wasn't his first victim, nor was she the only one carrying his dark secret. In the days following her diagnosis, Sister Maria retreated into silence. She still attended Mass, still led prayers, still smiled when spoken to. But something inside her had irrevocably changed. Her once steadfast faith had withered, replaced by a swirling storm of anger and despair. She struggled to reconcile the life she had devoted to God with the evil she now knew had infiltrated its core. Her nights were restless. She would lie awake in her small, sparsely furnished room, the tattered diary clutched to her chest. The words burned in her mind, each page a bitter reminder of the horrors Father Dominic had inflicted on others, and on her. She felt tainted, not just physically but spiritually. She prayed, though her prayers were no longer for guidance. They were cries for retribution. Maria began noticing things she had once ignored. The way Father Dominic lingered near certain parishioners, the false humility in his gestures, the subtle power he held over everyone around him. She realized how deeply the church was complicit in his crimes. The older nuns who whispered behind closed doors, the deacons who turned a blind eye, all of them protected him, allowing him to continue his abuse under the guise of piety. But Maria wasn't powerless anymore. The knowledge she now carried, the truth about Father Dominic, was a weapon, and she intended to use it. At first, Maria considered confronting him outright. She imagined storming into his office, throwing the diary in his face, and demanding justice. But what good would it do? Father Dominic wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of authority, of holiness, of everything the parish worshipped. If she exposed him, who would believe her? She had seen what happened to his other victims. They were silenced, dismissed, discredited. No, direct confrontation wasn't the answer. Maria decided she wouldn't just expose Father Dominic. She would destroy the parish from within, just as it had destroyed her. Her plan began small. During confessionals, she subtly probed parishioners, listening for clues about their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Some sought guidance for their infidelities. Others confessed to drinking too much, gambling, or harboring jealousy. Maria realized that, for all their outward appearances of righteousness, these people were just as flawed as anyone else. Her first target was Mr. Ellis, a wealthy businessman and one of Father Dominic's closest confidants. Mr. Ellis had always been generous with his donations, but Maria had overheard enough gossip to know that his hands weren't clean. He had been accused of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion, though no charges had ever stuck. Maria approached him one evening after Mass, feigning concern for his spiritual well-being. She suggested they meet privately for a special prayer session. He agreed, of course. Who would refuse the angelic Sister Maria? The meeting was held in a dimly lit room in the rectory. Maria prayed with him, listened to his confessions, and offered words of comfort. And then, with calculated precision, she seduced him. Mr. Ellis, blinded by his own ego and weakness, fell easily into her trap. He left that night unaware that she had just given him more than spiritual solace. Maria didn't feel guilt. In her mind, her actions were justified. She wasn't spreading harm, she was spreading justice. For every secret sin these people harbored, she would repay them in kind. Her next targets were chosen just as carefully: a school teacher with a hidden gambling addiction, a mother who emotionally abused her children, a deacon who secretly drank himself into oblivion every night. Maria approached each one with the same calculated kindness, using her reputation as a saintly figure to gain their trust. They saw her as a savior, never realizing the danger that lurked behind her serene eyes. Meanwhile, Father Dominic remained oblivious. He continued his sermons, his facade of holiness intact. Maria watched him with growing disgust, biding her time. She wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. Her plan wasn't complete. By the end of the month, the seeds of her vengeance were firmly planted. Parishioners began falling ill one by one, their symptoms eerily similar. Whispers spread through the congregation. No one suspected Maria. Not yet. But she knew it was only a matter of time before someone put the pieces together. St. Benedict's Church had always been a place of refuge, a sanctuary where secrets could be kept and sins could be forgiven. But now the whispers were growing. Something was wrong in the parish. The air was thick with unease, and no one could quite put their finger on why. It started with Mr. Ellis. Once the picture of health, he had begun to look pale and gaunt. His absence from the Sunday service was immediately noted by the congregation, as was the uncharacteristic silence of his wife, who usually occupied the front pew. When the rumors began, whispers of a sudden illness, hushed mentions of hospital visits, Maria kept her head low, pretending to know nothing. Then it was Mrs. Walker, the devoted Sunday school teacher. She had always been full of life, her laughter echoing through the hallways as she worked with the children. But now she was visibly weaker, her energy gone, her once vibrant spirit dimmed. Maria overheard a concerned mother whisper to another, "She doesn't look well, does she? Do you think it's something contagious?" The parishioners' unease deepened when Mr. Hart, the deacon known for his booming voice and sharp wit, abruptly resigned from his duties. He had become withdrawn, his fiery sermons replaced by an eerie quietness. As more parishioners fell ill, the whispers turned into murmurs of fear. Was it a virus? An outbreak? Someone mentioned the word HIV in passing, but it was quickly dismissed. HIV wasn't something that happened to people like them, faithful, upright members of the church. That was a problem for other people, other communities. Maria observed it all with a quiet satisfaction. The very people who had blindly followed Father Dominic, who had praised him while ignoring the growing cracks in their sanctuary, were now experiencing the same kind of helplessness she had felt. They were forced to confront their own vulnerabilities, their own mortality. But it wasn't just the congregation that was uneasy. Father Dominic had begun to notice the shift in the atmosphere. Attendance was slightly lower, and the energy in the room during Mass felt off. He could sense the fear, though no one dared speak of it directly. It made him uneasy, but not enough to question his own actions. He still held himself above reproach, untouchable in his position. Meanwhile, Maria continued her work, her outward demeanor unchanged. She still prayed with parishioners, taught Sunday school, and visited the sick. If anything, her acts of kindness seemed even more pronounced, as though she was doubling down on her image as the saintly Sister Maria. It was a calculated move. She knew that the more she entrenched herself in their trust, the less likely anyone would suspect her when the truth came to light. But there was one person who began to notice something strange about Maria: Jacob, a young journalist who had recently returned to the town. Jacob wasn't particularly religious, but his family had been members of St. Benedict's for generations. He had attended Mass as a child, and though he no longer considered himself devout, he still came by occasionally to visit his aging mother. Jacob had always been observant, a quality that served him well in his line of work. He noticed the pattern before anyone else did. The people who were falling ill were all connected: devout members of the church, regulars at Sunday Mass. But more than that, they were people who had recently spent time alone with Sister Maria. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence. Maria was a nun, after all. She spent time with everyone in the parish, but the more he thought about it, the more the pattern nagged at him. Why was it that only the people who had been close to her were affected? And why did Maria, who was constantly around the sick, never seem to fall ill herself? Jacob decided to dig deeper. He started asking questions, speaking to the families of the victims, and piecing together a timeline. He was careful not to raise suspicion. After all, accusing a nun of something so sinister would be unthinkable. But the more he uncovered, the more the puzzle began to take shape. Maria, meanwhile, had no idea she was being watched. She continued her work with precision, careful not to rush her plan. But as Jacob grew closer to the truth, she began to sense that something was amiss. She noticed him lingering after Mass, watching her from the corner of the room. She caught him asking questions, his notepad tucked under his arm. And for the first time since her plan had begun, Maria felt a flicker of fear. Still, she reminded herself, no one would ever believe him. She was Sister Maria, the saint of St. Benedict's. And saints didn't have secrets either, did they? Jacob's investigation led him to subtle but revealing patterns. The victims all had different backgrounds, but each had something in common. They had recently spent time alone with Sister Maria, often under the guise of seeking spiritual guidance or prayer. Jacob's first lead came from Mr. Ellis's wife, who mentioned how Maria had been particularly concerned about her husband's spiritual well-being in the weeks before he fell ill. It was an innocent remark, but Jacob noted the way her voice wavered, as though she wasn't entirely comfortable saying it. He began cross-referencing his findings with hospital reports and health records. While he couldn't access confidential details, he knew enough people in town to confirm the growing suspicion. The illnesses weren't random. They were connected. And the center of it all was Sister Maria. Jacob's first instinct was disbelief. What motive could she possibly have? The thought of someone like her deliberately harming others was almost laughable. But the more he uncovered, the harder it became to ignore. It wasn't just the victims who intrigued him. It was Maria herself. He started paying closer attention to her during Mass, during her community work, and during the moments when she thought no one was watching. From a distance, she seemed as radiant and devoted as ever. But up close, there were cracks in her facade. Her serene smile sometimes faltered when she thought she was alone. Her hands, always folded in prayer, occasionally trembled. Jacob decided he needed to confront her, but he knew he couldn't rush it. If his suspicions were wrong, accusing a nun of such a heinous act would destroy his reputation and alienate him from the community. He needed proof. One evening, Jacob caught his first real break. He overheard a conversation between Maria and Father Dominic in the rectory. Their voices were low, but the tension in the room was palpable. Jacob pressed his ear to the door, straining to make out the words. "You're playing a dangerous game," Father Dominic said, his voice sharp and commanding. "I'm not afraid of you," Maria replied, her tone cold and defiant. "You should be," Dominic hissed. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." The conversation ended abruptly, and Jacob barely managed to slip out of sight before Maria exited the room. But the exchange confirmed what he had suspected. There was more to Maria than met the eye, and Father Dominic was somehow involved. Jacob decided to confront Father Dominic first. He arranged a meeting under the pretense of writing a piece on the church's role in the community. The priest agreed, eager for the publicity. During the meeting, Jacob steered the conversation toward Maria, asking seemingly innocuous questions about her work and her relationship with the parishioners. At first, Dominic was dismissive, brushing off Maria as just another nun. But when Jacob pressed further, Dominic's composure began to crack. "She's troubled," he admitted, his voice tight. "She's been through a lot. The church is her sanctuary." Jacob didn't miss the way Dominic avoided his gaze or the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. There was something he wasn't saying. "Do you trust her?" Jacob asked. Dominic hesitated. "Trust is complicated," he said finally. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm that Dominic knew more than he was letting on. Jacob decided to shift his focus back to Maria. The next day, he approached her directly. It was after Mass, and the parishioners had mostly dispersed. Maria was in the garden, tending to the flowers, when Jacob appeared. "Sister Maria," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Do you have a moment?" She turned to him, her serene expression unchanging. "Of course, Mr. Bennett. How can I help you?" "I've been looking into some troubling patterns in the parish," Jacob said carefully, watching her reaction. Maria tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "Troubling? What do you mean?" Jacob hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "A number of parishioners have fallen ill recently. It seems unusual." For a brief moment he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, anger. He couldn't tell, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I hadn't noticed," Maria said softly. "Illness is part of life, I suppose. We must pray for their recovery." Her response was calm, measured, but Jacob wasn't convinced. "Do you mind if we speak more privately?" he asked. Maria hesitated. "Of course," she said finally. "Come with me." She led him to the rectory, where they sat across from each other in a small, dimly lit room. For the first time, Jacob felt a sense of unease. The air between them was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. "What is it you really want to know, Mr. Bennett?" Maria asked, her voice low. Jacob hesitated, his instincts warning him to tread carefully. He didn't yet have proof, but he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Sister Maria stared at Jacob, her calm demeanor unshaken, but he could feel the subtle shift in the air. She wasn't a woman caught off guard. She was calculating, measuring every word he said. Jacob knew he had to be careful. Without solid proof, any direct accusation would backfire, but he also sensed that Maria was testing him, waiting to see how far he would go. "I've noticed a pattern," Jacob began, leaning forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "The people who have fallen ill all seem to have one thing in common. They've been spending time with you." Maria blinked slowly, her expression unreadable. "I spend time with everyone, Mr. Bennett," she said gently. "That's my role here, to provide comfort and guidance to those in need. Are you suggesting I've done something wrong?" Her words were disarming, but Jacob refused to back down. "I'm not suggesting anything yet. But it's unusual, don't you think? These aren't random illnesses. There's a connection. And I think you know what it is." For the first time, Maria's serene mask cracked. Her lips tightened ever so slightly, and her gaze grew sharper. "Mr. Bennett, I've dedicated my life to this parish, to God, to helping others. If you have accusations to make, I suggest you make them clearly instead of dancing around your point." Her sudden firmness caught Jacob off guard, but he pressed on. "I think you've been hurt," he said, his voice softer now, probing for vulnerability. "I don't know how or by whom, but I believe it's changed you, and I believe it's made you dangerous." Maria's expression froze. For a moment she said nothing, and the silence in the room was deafening. Then slowly she stood, folding her hands in front of her. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice cold. "But you don't understand what you're meddling in. You don't know what it's like to be betrayed by the very people who claim to serve God, to be abandoned, humiliated, and yet expected to forgive." Jacob leaned back slightly, his instincts screaming at him to proceed with caution. "Then tell me," he said. "Help me understand." Maria's laugh was soft, almost bitter. "Understand? You can't begin to understand. You weren't here when it happened, when I was dragged into this world thinking it would save me, only to find out it was just another place for men like Father Dominic to hide their sins. I trusted him, and he shattered me." Jacob's heart raced. She was opening up, but he couldn't tell if it was a calculated move or genuine emotion breaking through. Either way, he had to keep her talking. "What did he do to you?" he asked gently. Maria's eyes darkened, and for the first time he saw the weight of her pain. "He took everything," she whispered. "And when I tried to fight back, the church protected him. They always protect men like him. Do you know what that feels like? To cry out for help and have your cries silenced? To be told to forgive the unforgivable because it's what God wants?" Her voice cracked, and Jacob felt a pang of something he hadn't expected. Sympathy. But beneath her words was something more, a seething, festering hatred that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "What you're doing now, this plan of yours," Jacob said carefully, "it won't bring you peace, Maria. It won't undo what happened to you." Maria's bitter smile returned. "Peace?" she said, shaking her head. "Peace is a luxury I can no longer afford. But justice? That's something I can achieve. I'm not doing this for myself, Mr. Bennett. I'm doing this for all the others, those whose voices were silenced, who were told to bow their heads and pray while their lives were destroyed. They'll finally understand what it feels like. They'll finally see the truth." Jacob's pulse quickened. He wasn't just close to the truth, she was practically confessing. But he knew he couldn't push her too far. Maria was like a cornered animal, and one wrong move could send her spiraling into something even more dangerous. "What about the people you've hurt?" he asked. "The ones who've fallen ill? Do you think they deserve this?" Maria's gaze hardened. "They're complicit," she said. "Every single one of them. They turned a blind eye to Dominic's crimes. They worshipped him, trusted him. While he destroyed lives, they're not innocent, Mr. Bennett. None of them are." Jacob stood, his mind racing. He had enough now. Not a full confession, but enough to paint a damning picture. But he also knew that exposing Maria wouldn't be simple. She was loved, revered, and trusted. And there was one more piece of the puzzle he needed to solve: Father Dominic. "You've made your point," Jacob said carefully, moving toward the door. "But this isn't over. I'll find the truth, Maria. All of it." She didn't stop him as he left, but he could feel her eyes on him the entire way out. As Jacob stepped into the night, his chest tightened with unease. Maria wasn't just dangerous. She was unpredictable. And he had the sinking feeling that whatever came next would be even darker than he'd imagined. The tension at St. Benedict's Church had reached a boiling point. Rumors about the growing number of sick parishioners were no longer whispers. They were full-blown conversations, hushed but urgent. People began avoiding one another, each fearful that they might be next. Attendance at Sunday Mass dropped dramatically, and the once close-knit community was unraveling before Jacob's eyes. But Jacob wasn't focused on the congregation. He had his sights set on Father Dominic. Maria's veiled confession had confirmed much of what Jacob suspected. Dominic was at the center of the web. He wasn't just complicit. He was the catalyst for everything Maria had done. Jacob decided it was time to confront Dominic directly and this time there would be no polite pretense of an interview. He needed answers. Jacob caught Father Dominic in his office late one evening poring over church records. The priest looked up, startled, as Jacob entered unannounced. "Mr. Bennett," Dominic said, attempting to mask his unease with a smile. "What can I do for you at this hour?" "I think you already know," Jacob replied, shutting the door firmly behind him. Dominic's smile faltered. "I'm afraid I don't understand." Jacob leaned against the desk, his voice low but sharp. "I spoke to Maria. She told me everything, or close enough. I know about the diary, Dominic. I know what you've done." The color drained from Dominic's face, but he quickly regained his composure. "Whatever lies Maria has told you, I assure you they're just that. Lies. She's troubled, Mr. Bennett. She's been through a great deal. You shouldn't let her poison your perception of this church." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "You're very good at deflecting, Father, but I'm not here for your excuses. You've been hiding behind this church for years, using it as a shield while you prey on the people who trust you the most." Dominic stood, his expression darkening. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jacob shot back. "Maria isn't your first victim, is she? And she won't be your last unless I stop you. I've seen men like you before, Dominic, men who think their position makes them untouchable. But let me make one thing clear. I'm not afraid of you." Dominic's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a calmness that sent a chill down Jacob's spine, he said, "You should be." While Jacob was confronting Dominic, Maria was finalizing her next move. She had long since accepted that her actions would eventually come to light, and she had no intention of denying them when they did. But before that happened, she wanted to ensure her message was heard. She began writing letters, one for each of her victims. In them, she detailed her reasons for targeting them, exposing the hypocrisies they had carefully hidden from the world. She spared no detail, forcing them to confront the sins they thought no one knew about. For Mr. Ellis, it was his financial crimes. For Mrs. Walker, it was the abusive way she treated her own family. Each letter was both a confession and an accusation, and Maria planned to deliver them personally. Her final letter was addressed to Father Dominic. It was the longest and most damning of all, detailing his years of abuse and the lives he had destroyed. In it, Maria revealed that she had already taken steps to expose him, leaving nothing to chance. Maria's intent wasn't just revenge. It was to burn the entire facade of St. Benedict's to the ground. The truth began to spill out faster than anyone in St. Benedict's church could have imagined. It started with Jacob's decision to take matters into his own hands. Armed with everything he had learned from Maria's veiled confession, his confrontation with Father Dominic, and the victims' stories, he published an article. The piece was titled, "Betrayal in the House of God: The Hidden Secrets of St. Benedict's." In the article, Jacob exposed the alarming rise in illnesses among the parishioners and questioned Maria's involvement. He didn't outright accuse her, he lacked concrete evidence, but he laid out enough of the pattern for readers to draw their own conclusions. More damning, he hinted at Father Dominic's role in Maria's descent, carefully suggesting that years of abuse and church complicity had created a dangerous storm. The article spread through the town like wildfire. By the time the next Sunday Mass came around, the church was almost empty. Those who did attend sat in tense silence, stealing glances at Father Dominic and Sister Maria, each wondering how much of the article was true. Maria, however, remained composed. She had anticipated this moment. In fact, she had been counting on it. When the time came for Father Dominic to give his sermon, he hesitated. His usual charisma was absent, his voice unsteady as he read from the Gospel. The tension in the room was unbearable. Finally, Maria stood. "Father," she said, her voice loud and clear, "may I speak to the congregation?" Dominic froze, his eyes narrowing. He knew what was coming, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. Slowly, he nodded. Maria turned to face the sparse crowd, her hands folded in front of her. "Many of you know me as Sister Maria," she began. "You've trusted me, you've confided in me, and for that I am truly grateful. But today, I must confess something to all of you." A murmur rippled through the congregation, but Maria's calm demeanor held their attention. "I have committed sins," she said, "grave sins, and I owe it to each of you to tell the truth." Maria then proceeded to recount her story. Not in full, but enough to paint a harrowing picture. She told them about her betrayal at the hands of Father Dominic, how she had been forced to carry the burden of his actions alone, how the church had failed to protect her and countless others. Her voice cracked as she spoke of her diagnosis, the pain and humiliation of discovering she had been infected with HIV without even knowing it. "I was broken," she said. "I cried out to God for justice, but no one answered. So I took it upon myself to act, and in my anger, I lost my way." She admitted to targeting certain parishioners, using their trust in her to harm them. "I believed I was delivering justice," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But in truth, I was only spreading more pain. And for that, I ask for your forgiveness." The church was silent. Some parishioners stared at her in horror, others in disbelief. But Maria's eyes were fixed on Father Dominic. "There is more," she said, her voice steady now. "The man you trust to lead this church, the man you call your shepherd, has sins of his own to confess. Father Dominic, will you deny it? Will you deny what you did to me, to the others?" All eyes turned to Dominic. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Maria stepped closer to him, her voice rising. "You stole my innocence," she said. "You betrayed your vows, your parish, and the God you claimed to serve, and you hid behind this church while people like me paid the price." Dominic finally found his voice. "These are lies," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's deranged. Her illness has clouded her mind." But Maria wasn't finished. She reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out the diary, the tattered book that contained everything Dominic had done. She held it high for everyone to see. "This is the truth," she said. "Every word written by another victim who was silenced by this church. Read it. Judge for yourselves." The room erupted into chaos. Parishioners stood shouting accusations and questions at Dominic. Some stormed out, unable to bear the weight of the revelations. Others demanded answers, pressing forward as Dominic tried to flee the altar. Maria remained standing at the pulpit, watching as the world she had known crumbled around her. By the end of the day, Father Dominic had been escorted out of the church by local authorities. Jacob's article, coupled with Maria's confession, had spurred an immediate investigation. Witnesses began coming forward, and the secrets that Dominic had buried for years were dragged into the light. But Maria's confession had consequences of its own. Her admission to deliberately harming parishioners couldn't be ignored. She was arrested the following morning and charged with multiple counts of assault and endangerment. Jacob visited Maria in jail a few days later. She sat behind the glass partition, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked tired, but oddly at peace. "You didn't have to confess," Jacob said. "You could have stayed silent. You could have run." Maria smiled faintly. "What would have been the point? My story was never going to end in freedom, Jacob. But at least now the truth is out. The people who needed to see it have seen it." Jacob hesitated. "Do you regret it, any of it?" Her eyes softened. "I regret the harm I caused," she said. "But I don't regret exposing him. That man destroyed lives, and he would have destroyed more if no one stopped him." Jacob nodded, unsure of what to say. As he stood to leave, Maria called out to him. "Tell my story," she said. "Not just the bad parts. Tell them why." Father Dominic faced the full weight of justice. The diary Maria had revealed, combined with the testimonies of his victims and Jacob's relentless reporting, left no room for denial. He was convicted of charges of sexual assault, abuse of power, and endangering the welfare of others. The court case was grueling, with harrowing testimonies from women who had been silenced for years. Dominic, once revered as a spiritual leader, was sentenced to decades in prison. His name became synonymous with hypocrisy and corruption. Maria's own trial was a different kind of spectacle. Public opinion was divided. To some, she was a monster who had taken justice into her own hands, harming innocent people in her quest for vengeance. To others, she was a tragic figure, a victim of systemic abuse who had been pushed to the brink. The judge ultimately sentenced Maria to 15 years in prison. While the court acknowledged her status as a victim and the trauma she had endured, her deliberate actions couldn't go unpunished. Maria accepted the sentence without protest, and that's the story of Sister Maria, a woman whose faith turned to fury and whose search for justice changed a community forever. If you were gripped by this tale, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more intense and thought-provoking stories like this one. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Maria's shoes? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.